And so, yes, I am going to talk at you for a bit about some considerations that in our experience can be really helpful to consider in guiding advocacy efforts such that they're meaningful, relevant, and impactful. And this will look different for each of you. This framework is really sort of open and very customizable and individualized based on a variety of factors. And hopefully this framework is just a helpful anchor for you to consider how you can build it out, informed by your expertise of your local area, your state, your community, as you're the experts of your own spots. And so first, it's really vital to know your audience. So to whom you're advocating. A good starting point in our experience is to really seek out information on what's important to them, such that you're attuned to what they value, which will help you start where they're at and not where we might wish they were or where we might want them to end up or be. And this slide just has some considerations basically. And if you can find information on things like how often someone has written, sponsored, or co-sponsored legislation that relates to topics relevant to trauma-informed change, or maybe take a look at people's voting histories, that information is often available. See if they have interest, how they vote on similar topics. You can start to get a sense of what motivates them and what they already value, where we can align with them on this. And in addition to some of these just basic considerations and looking into the background of your specific advocacy targets, we also want to talk a little bit about how useful it can be to familiarize yourself with the general landscape about topics relevant to your advocacy efforts. And when it comes to integrating trauma-informed policies and practices, impactful programming, and promising interventions, these already exist in a large capacity. Based on the document that Jesse is putting in the chat, we know that people are on board with these ideas. There's action happening. There are models to look to, and there are actions that can be replicated across your area to support individual and collective healing and resiliency. And if you're a regular participant on these calls, you've probably heard many examples that resonated with you that you might be able to call to when we're looking at how we can successfully implement trauma-informed and resilience-informed and healing-centered action. And there may not be a need, so to speak, for you to reinvent the wheel in whatever solutions that you're proposing. And it can also be helpful to really take a look at other legislative examples of how similar funding to what we're talking about today has been distributed to advance a trauma and resilience-informed approach. I actually track some of this information federally and across states. So I have this 200+ page document detailing legislative efforts that I can drop in the chat a little bit later that you might find interesting, might be a good barometer to say, in this state, they were implementing this particular policy in this way using this funding. What would that look like in our place? And how can we use that successful implementation and translate that to our advocacy efforts and use that as inspiration and evidence for our own, what we are looking to accomplish. And again, the fact that this is over 200 pages, this document now really says a lot about how promising efforts really can be. So much is happening, as Dan and Jesse mentioned in the beginning of this meeting. There is a lot of trauma-informed action that you can look to inspire your efforts and see what's working, see what other people are up to. And as you examine other examples of what's already happening, consider what you know about your community or your state and what's already in place resource-wise to implement the change that you're advocating for, things like funding, staffing, infrastructure, programming, things like that. And including this information with your proposed solutions, we've learned can be really influential in your advocacy efforts. So just some high-level points here for you to review in your time. And as you take a look at that information, you may notice that your advocacy target is already talking this talk or walking this walk themselves. Woohoo, that is fabulous and exciting. If people are already proposing or implementing policy changes aligned with your efforts, or they sit on relevant committees and seem to be interested in this content, you may not have to do as much educating or convincing. And you may even have a champion on your hands, which is someone who is really likely to file, enthusiastically sponsor, or otherwise propel policies and programming that are aligned with your efforts forward. And also, importantly, someone who may actively solicit their colleagues to support your advocacy goals as well. So remember that people can assume leadership positions over time as well. So even if the person that you're talking to who seems to champion this is not necessarily the head of a committee or seemingly has a lot of influence right now, members really can work their way up to being committee heads. They can have a lot of influence in a lot of different ways. So know that any allies that you can find are fantastic and valuable, and those relationships must be nurtured. So if you find yourself in this situation, building and sustaining relationships with established or potential champions and really remaining as a reliable and responsive resource to them, wow, what an opportunity to join forces with you as experts, again, of your communities, your states, where you are, and your legislators with sage wisdom and knowledge about what's really needed and what it really would take procedurally or pragmatically to move your joint efforts forward. And we also know that the reality is that, hey, not everyone is going to be working with a champion as an advocacy target, and that is a-okay and also an exciting opportunity as well. It doesn't mean that you can't make important progress just because they're not already on board. And we would actually caution against eschewing opportunities to collaborate based on any assumed ideology or political affiliation. It's good to get that intel, but it's not a be-all, end-all. And we believe that, in fact, it behooves you as advocates to approach every conversation with the intention to find common ground and commonalities. There are so many causes within this overarching umbrella of trauma-informed policies and practices that many people can coalesce around and align on. And unlikely partners joining together to advocate for change can help shift attitudes and norms in circles that truly, like, you may not otherwise have a lot of influence or reach in. And you can leverage one another's influence once they're on board to bolster the credibility of your transformational advocacy agenda across those traditional divides, which of course increases the likelihood for implementation and progress. And hey, maybe they won't buy into every single thing that you propose, yet certain pieces of your ask resonate with them that they're willing to act on and willing to advocate for. And so as you're collecting information and intel, it can be really helpful to anticipate potential barriers and arguments against your proposed solution, as well as that common ground. So you can sort of strategize around changing hearts and minds where possible and if needed. And for neutral folks and those who may on the surface seem like non-allies, consider, what do they need to know? And from whom do they really need to hear it to be swayed? Maybe you can join forces with another entity or individuals who already have a relationship as well, and thinking about what frame will resonate best with them. Just a lot to consider here. So again, high-level points for you to return to and really think deeply about in the context of where you are. And so regardless of where your advocacy targets currently are at, it's important that you gather information that will be most impactful based upon what you do learn about them. Now, by virtue of, again, all of you being on this call, you probably have some foundational knowledge and perhaps some real specific expertise about trauma and resilience-informed policies and practices. So to ensure credibility among your targets, it's really important to be transparent about what we know to be objectively true based on the evidence we have, what our assumptions, best hopes, and educated hypotheses that we are projecting to them are. And also, that might mean that you need to take a little bit of a deeper dive into some certain topics to be able to apprise yourself of the most recent research and all of the different dimensions of these issues. They're pretty complex when you go underneath the surface. And This next slide also has some considerations for you to return to as you formulate your advocacy strategy. Again, just sort of general points that we found to be really effective. A continuation on this slide, and I just want to lift up that this can seem overwhelming. And so, at least in my personal experience, starting with your intended outcomes, after implementation, what would you notice different that would tell you that your strategy was effective and successful? Thinking about that can be a great starting point. And then sort of working backwards to identify insights and resources, both qualitative and quantitative evidence that most clearly supports that solution. You can really build your case around that and get some momentum by starting that way. So for instance, if you're looking at, you notice economic inequality or disproportionate financial instability as a source of perpetuating trauma in your community or adversity or toxic stress, and you're trying to get decision makers to direct funding to support training and technical assistance to implement a trauma-informed approach to early childhood care services, you may find it useful to emphasize the brain science around how positive interactions and healthy attachments at this stage, during which there's just critical construction happening, how that's demonstrated to produce these myriad positive outcomes across individual, family, and community domains, and use the compelling data that really is available to support that positive framework. And you can still make clear, of course, what the quote unquote problem is. We know that early adversity has lasting adverse impacts that can affect people and our society as a whole in really indelible ways. And we can still say that and highlight the solutions and resilience and the possibility for healing and growth that truly exists on the micro, meso, and macro levels. It's a both and, not an either or from our perspective. And on this slide and on the next, you'll just find a couple of infographics. We're just lifting these up because we want to convey that there are resources out there that you can take a look at as a starting point for sort of adjunctive pieces to your storytelling and your visits. Leave behinds really can have a strong at-a-glance impact, keep things on people's minds, keep it front of mind and maybe front of conversation in their office. And the impact on these concise types of ways to convey evidence tend to resonate and be easy, more approachable than lengthy written documents. So things like infographics, fact sheets, policy briefs, those quick but memorable informational pieces that strengthen and align with your case and which can help decision and policymakers eventually justify their support for your solutions. They might then take them up themselves and share them out. And those can be really effective in our experience. And again, this is another specifically from Star Commonwealth about the challenges of the pandemic and that you may draw inspiration from. We're not saying you have to use these materials, just sort of like this is something that's really effective that we found has worked. The links are embedded in the slides for you to check out later, and you may have others that you reach for, and that's a-okay too. It's really about keeping this on their minds, keeping it in the conversation. And on this slide, there's also just some information for you to return to later. It's a lot to look at. As you think about the structure for building sustained, meaningful relationships with key decision and policymakers, the meetings that you have, we believe, form that sort of milieu in which some of the most important work is done. And having real relationships instead of just sort of one-off conversations, which can be great, but might not be as productive, tends to contribute to more impactful outcomes. And if you're newer to advocacy, please know that meeting with a staff member instead of directly with the person you might be working to influence is a stellar, exciting, delightful opportunity. Wow. You get more time to make your case with staff than you will likely ever get with a legislator directly. And if you can convince staffers that you speak to that the issue is important and the policy solution that you're proposing is in their wheelhouse and something that will be beneficial to them and the constituents in that area, you are far more likely to actually score an eventual meeting with an elected official themselves if that does happen down the line. And furthermore, staff can often make decisions about what a legislator might support. They have conversations that you might not be a part of. They are in the know about what they already are thinking about with those legislators. And so if you ask for a commitment If your argument is compelling enough that staff think that it's a great idea, they might be able to answer you on the legislator's behalf right then and there, or if not, get in contact, have a conversation and an ongoing dialogue. Keeping that conversation alive, again, is really a big part of maintaining this relationship, not just having it be a one-off. So with staff, be excited, be respectful, be grateful for the time, and be convincing when you tell your stories of self, us, and now. Now, a bit about this storytelling framework that I'm about to talk about for a couple of minutes. I was fortunate enough to be selected for sponsorship from my school in my MSW program a few years ago to attend the Congressional Research Institute for Social Work and Policy's Advocacy Bootcamp program. And this is where I learned this framework. It really resonated with me. It was one of the most impactful aspects of the bootcamp. And it's a framework through which stories that need to be heard can effectively be told in this context. And these stories are really effective. You know, this was an exercise that really stuck with me. Stories they connect people to the data that you've collected. Stories lend an emotional potency and convey urgency. Stories have the power to counter stereotypes and foster connections across divides, as well as strengthen alliances to catalyze action. And so this framework, while I learned it at CRISP, which is the acronym that I said for that long name of the bootcamp that I went to, it actually, as indicated on this slide, originates from Marshall Gans, who is at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And there's a lot more information about this model than the quick primer I'm going to give you today. If you're curious to learn more, you can give it a Google. At a high level, the story of self, which is the first circle on the left there, this involves you really just describing the events, the challenges, the choices that led you to act as you are here as an advocate today. So being really judicious about what we include in our story based on what we've learned about our target audience and their values can really enhance motivation to take action toward change. My guess is there are parts that align there when you really dig deep. And maybe there's a lot of overlap in what brought you to the work and your experiences and maybe your advocacy target has made comment to similar experiences, or they've supported similar things in the past. So taking that into consideration and choosing very strategically what you share about what brought you to the work in an authentic and effective way. Then moving to the story of us, which captures those shared values, experiences, and capacities of folks joining together as we all are to work toward change. So that could be us as a national advocacy network, a more localized advocacy group with whom you're affiliated, or my personal preference, members of your community with lived experience and providers and survivors alike. The fact of the matter is, as constituents, you have power, and decision makers will listen to you and others for that reason much more than they'll listen to those of us who are here in the swamp, the shining city on the hill, whatever you want to call us here in the DC area. You matter, your voices matter, and you can strengthen the story of us through connecting with community members. And I do want to mention here that in this part, as I mentioned that, it's important to consider who is the appropriate messenger for some of the information that you may glean through those conversations. Just assure that you're getting permission to share any specific stories if you're integrating that into the conversation that may otherwise not directly be yours to tell, in which case maybe you can bring someone with you to support your advocacy efforts, teach them this framework and have them tell their story of self and join together for the story of us. There are a lot of different ways that you can use these pieces to create change. It's a very general and flexible framework. And as a side note, just because we're talking about community connections, engaging with people with lived experience when formulating solutions in general is a vital part of this process of advocacy to assure that your proposed solutions actually fit the needs and preferences of those who are most directly impacted. So staying connected to that is important. And then the story of now really outlines the current challenges in a way that presents a vision for change and a potential outcome that is powerful, productive, and within reach if your advocacy targets were to join the effort. So a part of this is really highlighting the urgency of the situation, as we mentioned before, as well as those positive solutions, and summoning your target audience to take concrete next steps to bring about change. So really making the quote unquote ask, if you will. And so this framework, basically taken together, is here's the challenge, here's how I'm involved, here's how community members and constituents are impacted, here's why it's relevant to you, and here's a solution for action grounded in a realistic sense of hope to make a meaningful impact that we can only achieve with your help. And with this powerful framework, your targets can begin to sort of see themselves as the hero character in this story, which can move them to act and join this movement in a really powerful way. And this is certainly, I just want to say, this is just one framework for storytelling that I'm excited to share with you because it resonated with me. Many of you are seasoned advocates and you might have found something that works better for you, and that's wonderful as well. So hopefully for those who are hoping for some guidance or a starting point to build on and just thinking about, okay, I have all these facts, I don't really know how to put a narrative together yet. Hopefully this is a good foundation to build on as you formulate your own story to tell. And finally, I just want to call attention to the fact that we know it can be intimidating to put some of this out there in the first place. There are so many different competing demands, and we want to remind you that at the campaign, we're here to support you and that your efforts are also supported by a substantial network of tenacious, ardent advocates. All of the progress that Dan and Jesse made comment to earlier could not be possible without the people on this call and other advocates doing this work. And there are so many lessons learned and resources to be shared to help you make the greatest impact so that you can cut through some of the other noise and tell your story in a way that contributes to change. The more of us that get out there and tell these stories, the more likely our vision of a preferred future that uses this incredible opportunity that Dan's going to talk to you about in just a second after I stop flapping my mouth to direct funding to that which honors lived experience and promotes healing and growth and resiliency and prevents further harm from happening. And so with that, I am going to pass it to Dan to shine a spotlight on some of the specific actions that you can lift up and make the ask for in your advocacy efforts.